Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Dublin City University. It's a beautiful afternoon here in Dublin. So I'm delighted on behalf of the university to welcome you to this important discussion on EU strategic autonomy 2 years into the war in Ukraine. I'm particularly pleased and proud on your behalf to welcome this afternoon the former President of Lithuania, Her Excellency Dalia Grybauskaitė. We're honoured that you could join us, and we're particularly pleased that His Excellency, the Ambassador of Lithuania, is with us for this discussion as well. I'm really pleased, and I commend the Brexit Institute for addressing this important issue for us here today. The ongoing war in Ukraine has had a very profound impact on the European Union and on the lives of all of us citizens. In particular, it has raised critical questions about the European Union's strategic autonomy itself. So today's high-level event is very timely. We see Russia opening new fronts in the war and scoring some successes. This is also a year of elections in Europe and beyond. It's the so-called Super Bowl of elections. Lithuania went to the polls on Sunday last, and the European Parliament elections will take place early next month. I'm very pleased too to see very large numbers of our students and graduates taking part in both local elections and European elections. At least 3 of the candidates in this constituency in Dublin alone are graduates of Dublin City University. So our keynote speaker today, we're very lucky to have in her someone who has worked at the highest levels and who understands the complexities and challenges of the current situation, as well as being president of Lithuania, of course, with immediate kind of connections with Ukraine and that world. She served as European Commissioner for Financial Programming and Budgets from 2004 2009. She's also a member of the high-ranking International Task Force on security and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. So we look forward to hearing your insights and thoughts on these matters, Excellency. As many of you know, this is just the latest in a series of high-level events organised by the Brexit Institute at DCU, and these provide a space for informed and robust discussions on European issues, not least with the exit of the United Kingdom from the European Union. The Brexit Institute aligns with our vision here at the university that we would be recognised as a leading innovative European university. We're European in terms of our location, but obviously our character and our values. As a university, we're committed to transforming lives and societies. And the Brexit Institute plays a really vital role in delivering on our ambitions and spearheading the research at DCU on European affairs. So I'd like to thank our director, Cavaliere Federico Fabbrini, and his colleagues in the Institute for their dynamic and impactful work. I particularly today like to single out Dr. Niall Moran for his work in putting today's programme together for us. And finally, I'd like to welcome and introduce and hand over the baton now to our esteemed moderator, Una Mullally, who's from the Irish Times. And Una will introduce the speakers and chair the subsequent discussion. So you're very welcome again. And Una, it's my great pleasure to ask you to take the floor. Thank you, Una.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Daire, and welcome everyone. Great to see so many people joining this conversation. Just to let you know how the event will run, first we'll have our keynote speaker, the former President of Lithuania, Dalia Grybauskaitė. This will be followed by some questions, so please consider yours as you go. You can put them in the chat box, you can also raise your hands. There'll be 2 opportunities to ask questions, which will be chosen and kind of moderated by Federico and Niall. After that first conversation, we'll have our panel discussion and another round of audience questions as well. The event will run for 90 minutes, so we'll be all wrapped 5:30 Dublin time, 6:30 Brussels time, and so on. So we're hoping for a really rich and informative discussion. Ahead of that, I'd like to just thank everyone, the panel, for participating. All the speakers have expertise in the area of international economic law, international relations, as well as, of course, European Union and EU-China relations. So our panelists are Dr. Cécile Pelaudeix, Dr. Niall Moran, Professor Ming. I'll introduce them more thoroughly later in the discussion. And the context for this event is, of course, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and its profound impact on the European Union, which we are all feeling. This context demonstrates the importance of discussing these ideas around strategic autonomy in wartime, and of course in advance of the European Parliament elections. So we'll be talking about the European Union's economic security, and the relative geopolitical awakening following the invasion of Ukraine, and also the legal, economic and geopolitical perspectives on EU strategic autonomy. So again, please participate by asking questions in the chat box, and we'll get to those questions following the speakers' contributions. And you'll also be able to raise your hand virtually, and we'll endeavour to get to you all. Our keynote speaker today is the former president of Lithuania, President Grybauskaitė, who of course has a deep involvement expertise on all of this, as president of Lithuania from 2009 to 2019. Minister for Finance 2001 to 2004, and as European Commissioner for Financial Programming and Budget from 2004 to 2009. So Dalia, I'd like to invite you to speak now and to share your thoughts. Thank you very much for being here.
Okay, now I am on mute. It was not immediate. Okay, hello everybody. And then I got this proposal to come and talk. Always was the first surprise for me, the name of your institute, Brexit Institute. So it's associated in our mind with something getting out from the organization. Or somebody else withdrawal from organization. So, but anyway, it's good that your institution is very much deeply interested in European affairs, and of course in geopolitical actualities. We are in, all of us. And about strategic autonomy of Europe, we started to talk a lot before the war in Ukraine. And this was initiated mainly by the French President Macron in his first cadency. And we, especially in our region, in Baltic states, Poland, we have been very much skeptical in the very beginning, because it was mainly directed directly to the NATO and American influence into the military capabilities of NATO. And for us, being on the border with Russia, we felt that, and we knew that, especially in defense sector, Europe is absolutely not capable to compete with the American capacities. About 80% of military capacity still is American, and we have been very skeptical to this idea. But the life, and as always I'm saying, Putin helps us in a lot of ways to realize what is important in life. So after the war, which we saw in Ukraine in 2020, the situation with autonomy questions and discussions changed radically, mainly because Europe very much clearly faced its weaknesses, not only in defense, but weaknesses also in energy security, in cybersecurity. Then pandemic came, of course, health security and digital technologies. We have been attacked as Europe and democracies in general, and the West in wide sense of this word, not only militarily, but also by ideological attacks, by hybrid war, by lies and fake news, and plus, of course, as usually, energy was used to weaponize our politics and to corrupt European politics. So all this flown very openly and visibly that during the war, all these things have been very much outspoken instead of us, and now we all discussing about open autonomy strategy, which was adopted in 2020, which was mainly connected to energy security and how to solve the energy diversification and new technology questions, agriculture and food security, digital and health. And these are the main pillars of autonomy strategy, so-called open autonomy strategy. But on economic security strategy, Europe started to adopt a lot of acts, including Cybersecurity Act, economic security strategy. All these things are now rolling in the pipeline, some adapted, some in the pipeline, but that's only actions and strategies. In these 2-3 years, we realized that our defense capabilities are so downlying that we need only not to restore them, but almost to build from the scratch. The defense spending was so low 2-3 years ago that, for example, Germany was not spending even 1% to its defense. Now everything, because of war, changed radically. So the war and very critical situations usually help. It is a challenge, but usually this challenge helps very much to move faster with reforms and with a lot of changes. And because, especially with this war, brutal war on European border, makes Europeans, especially European politicians, make more aware about necessities, what we need to do. Then we have 2 other geopolitical points with China, where in the very beginning of this European Commission's cadency, the logo was made that we need to de-risk from China, but not to decouple. Now it's a little bit changing also, with variations. Now, because of war, it is important for us to try to keep China at least neutral, not supporting so much directly Russian military machine. And why probably we're seeing Macron's meetings in Europe and President Xi meeting coming into Europe. Then, of course, we have United States in the house, political house before the elections. And this political house already cost Ukraine loss of territories, people, because of this 6 months delay. And for us, it is also a message that even after elections, the political house in US probably will stay, no matter who will win, one or another, because in the political landscape is very divided. People are very divided in US, and this will reflect in future after elections in the more or less the same way, because one or House or Senate will be in different hands. And that means both, no matter who will be president, will be quite limited in streamlining their decision making. But with Trump, and that's another question, and I hope somebody will ask me about Europe's preparation for it. So from this point of view, the geopolitical strategic landscape is falling in pieces. I can say that globalization is still on the path of regionalization. So that means still we are more concentrating our efforts in regional structures. And it's not only about Europe, it's a regional organization in Africa, regional in Asia, and regional in Latin America. And then, of course, if we come and climb more globally up, we can see the global south, so-called, who is more or less against the global west. And this polarization during these wars, not only in Europe, but also now in Palestine, shows that geopolitical tensions and problems and challenges will increase for decades to come and will be not solved so fast and easy. That again increases necessity for Europe to go and think about security of its economy, And this goes into this concept of open autonomy of European continent and European Union in all sectors, not only in military, not only in energy, but not only in food security, in technologies. So we are in the competitive, very much, I will even say, in rival competition with other continents and regions, and this shows also that in such times we're a little bit falling backwards from globalization and from multinational organizations. They are losing their powers, they are paralyzed, and more we're closing ourselves into the regions. It's not very good from strategic long-term view, but probably it's nearest decades our tendency, not only in Europe, but also in US and in China and in other unities which we're seeing as Russia is receiving friendship and support from such countries as Iran and North Korea, and even from some African countries. So that's new geopolitical reality, and not only Ukrainian war, not war in Ukraine exposed this new reality, but also the conflicts and war in Palestine and Gaza, and also the political instability, I will say, in some large countries, our partners, which also influences global security landscape and economic situation of the world. So that's more or less the very fluid, very difficult to predict in nearest years exactly how it will go. But for decades to come, it's tensions, it's challenges, more or less the direction we are going all. And we need to adapt very fast to try to increase our resilience very fast, because rivalry outside Europe especially is not waiting and not giving us time to prepare. We need to do this on the run, just living and changing and reforming ourselves and securing ourselves. So that's more or less how we see the picture. And now we can go for questions.
Great, thank you so much for that. If anybody has questions, please put them in the chat or raise your hand, and Federica or Niall will get to you. But just going to kick off by asking a few things. I guess one of the kind of less tangible things, but I think it's important to ask is how big a role does naivety play amongst some member states with regards to Russia's aims in Europe? And how do you think the EU can kind of counter that lag in action, or the multiple lags in actions we're seeing, particularly across cybersecurity and hybrid attacks, and those various tactics utilized to undermine democracy that you mentioned?
You know, in the very beginning, not in the very beginning, but a few years ago, the word naivete was on the lips, and it was possible to use this word. Now I think it's not naivete. I think that Western civilization is so different from Russian civilization that it's impossible even to understand how Russia's mentality and mainstream regime's mentality is working, what Russian imperialism means and how they see the world, what goals they have and mission they think they're supposed to perform in changing all the world, securing the world, and saving the world from bad West. So it's clash civilizations. It's not just naivete of not understanding of just Russia. It's clash of civilizations. And we went so far in the West from this, and from understanding of security, democracy, human rights, everything. We went so far that we're not able to understand anymore what to expect from Russia, what kind of brutality we can expect. Ukrainians understand. We on the border still a little bit understand, but we're losing this understanding already. Ukrainians, why they're able to fight that way? Because for them, they understand. Still, they're not so far from the history and development. They understand Russians a lot better than we are, and they know that they need to fight, but to the end. There is no way to give in with anything, with territory, with people, with anything. So while even in the West, even now, after such brutality we saw on Ukraine's territory, there are a lot of discussions on how long the war will be. Maybe it's too costly. Maybe let's leave some territories as a compromise. With such civilization as today we see Russian imperialism, there is no way to have any compromises or think that if we will give in something, they will not come after us even more. So it's not naivete. It's misunderstanding and it's very difficult even in our society sometimes to explain. But if I go, for example, more far from the border, it's less and less feeling of the war exists, and the feeling of what risks are and what could be. So in reality, it's a clash of so different level of civilizations. Why it is so dangerous? Because still we are not in the mood of defending ourselves seriously, while the Russia's imperialism and all elite and all economy is now turning towards fully war mood of economy and people, and ideological indoctrination is so huge that absolute amount of population is supporting these imperialistic ideas and even attacks and even this brutality against its neighbors. So that's what we not able to understand, not because of naivete, but because it's impossible to believe it, that it could be such kind of ideology in 21st century in Europe. On cybersecurity, the second part of your question was, the cybersecurity is now the tool of the war. And if we do not have today the direct military conventional attack, but we do have cyber attacks. In Lithuania, for example, only last year was more than 80,000 attacks a year. So, and this more from smaller to larger, but this our infrastructure, including energy, banking sector, businesses, public services, governments, that's our everyday life. And more this we do see in Europe, and especially during the elections, in European elections, national elections. And this is very dangerous because this is one of the tools how to influence societies, how to paralyze the work of society, and it's the first step in full-scale confrontation. So from this point of view, it's very good that Europe is also accepting and making preparations with Cybersecurity Act, which was adopted in Parliament in March this year, finally. And we do have so-called security shield concept in Europe already, cyber and emergency mechanism already, helping each other in the case of attack or one or another member state, and cybersecurity incident review also. So this three-point of mechanism already is created, and we're trying to do our best. But of course, the attacks are sometimes more damaging than we even able to imagine, and this is our everyday life now.
Colin Joyce in the chat asks, why has Europe tolerated businesses continuing to trade in Russia, and mentions a report from the Financial Times today about one Austrian bank continuing to earn over 50% of its profits from Russia. He asks, how is this?
Which bank? Which bank?
An Austrian bank. I'm not sure of the exact
Austrian bank? We do not have Austrian bank in Lithuania. Maybe it's some kind of mistake.
Okay, I'm not sure about that, but I guess the broader point being,
all our banks are Nordic countries, from Nordic countries. Raffian Finance? No.
Raffian Finance, yeah.
Yeah, I am reading. I have no idea about this name. It's not. I never heard about it, about such kind of bank in Lithuania, really. So yes, we have a screening. We have the very public and energetic journalism, who is investigative journalism, who is trying to investigate and expose the companies which are not directly. Now nobody directly does the business in Russia, but via third or fourth countries, we're still catching, but it's very small amount, and we're doing this very publicly, trying to blame them and shame them, and really if they are breaching their sanctions, they even could be prosecuted. So this is done, and publicly people are very, very aware and very critical, but as I said, always you never know who is doing this, but in comparison with percentage, no large businesses or serious businesses are involved in Russia at all from Lithuania.
From your point of view, what would be the smartest things to do right now with regards to EU energy security?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just reading that. I think the Austrian bank referred to is the Raiffeisen. It's not in our country, not supposed to be. I never heard that name, that they have such a relation. Okay, so you asked something.
Yeah, I was just wondering from your point of view, what would be the smartest things to do right now with regards to European Union energy security, maybe steps that haven't already been taken?
Yeah, the energy crisis a year and a half ago made us rethink our strategies. Of course, the Putin's behavior with cutting some supplies and closing the Nord Stream 2 also was very good pressure to Europeans. The Baltic states managed to do it a lot earlier. For example, Lithuania, we opened the LNG terminal already in 2014, and we cut it Gazprom out from Lithuania already at that time, and we were able to help Latvia and Estonia with our capacity. So we did this, and even Germany then was started in Ukraine, copied our methodology, how can you produce LNG very fast, and they were copying some technologies from us and know-how. So now there is a lot more in Europe understanding of energy security. So there are a lot of things adapted with the alternative, for example. Yeah, I see that from Russia, yes, some countries are buying, especially Hungary and others. Yes, they're buying, and now even sometimes because we have LNG terminals in Poland, Finland, Estonia, now Lithuania, Russia is dropping prices very rapidly. But as I said, the Baltic states are not buying energy, especially gas from Russia. And this is very good. We are small, not very rich, but we were able to resist and not to resist this temptation to have cheaper energy resources from Russia than some other countries. They're doing this slowly, but we're already producing about 25% from alternative resources, and Europe is now planning at least by 2030 to have about 40% from alternative resources and to cut dependency on conventional energy resources more and more. Plus, of course, we have hydrogen technologies, and new technologies are coming, and that's clear that dependence on Russia's energy resources is not only immoral now during the war. Yes, I see that China and India using this, but as I said, there is not only the price calculation here, but morality, responsibility, and direct support of military machine of Russia. So Europe cannot afford this to do, because Europe is under attack directly. China and India think that they're not attacked. so they can behave in that way. But that's up to them to decide, which we can blame, of course, and I'm blaming this. We're doing this in our region, and we think that any support of Russia in any way, even buying the energy, to buy anything from Russia, it's support for the imperialism of Russia and terrorism, what we're seeing on our border.
I see Federico Fabrini has a question. Federico, if you'd like to ask.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm taking the opportunity of having Dalia here to ask her a question as well. And it's actually a question that somehow you solicited, Dalia, from your opening remarks. I wanted to ask you about Europe's preparation for Trump, and more specifically focusing on the defense of Europe. Of course, in the Baltic nations and Central and Eastern Europe, almost every country has met the NATO spending target. But if Trump fulfills his promise of withdrawing from NATO, of course, that creates a big question for us in the EU, how to increase our defense. And so my blunt question to you is, what would be your proposal to make the EU ready for a possible military confrontation? What should we do as a European Union if the US and NATO are no longer there after November?
NATO and US will be there after November, no matter what elections will be. Trump is predictably unpredictable, but that's the best thing about him, because he will be unpredictable also for enemies, including for Russians. This ambiguity is very good, and we are capable and preferably will be using this ambiguity, because today White House is quite weak. Today's White House was not able to manage 6 months of aid to Ukraine, and not able to manage conflict inside House and Senate. So from this point of view, the situation could be more or less the same after Trump election, but Trump is manageable. I had an experience with him in the first meeting of his in NATO in Brussels, and he's manageable. Only you need to know how to do it, and the first Europe needs not only to rely fully all the time on the Trump or America, but to invest ourselves. And for example, today Baltic states are investing 3%, and Poland almost 4% on their GDP to defense. We are restoring and recreating the defense industry, including we are building in our industry some ammunition with Germans together, ammunition industry in Lithuania and in Baltic states and Poland. So we are pushing to that direction to be more self-reliant, but even if Trump will come, there is no possibility immediately to drop everything. So from this point of view, I'm not so worried. I'm very seriously thinking that we need to find strategy, how to talk, how to deal with New America if they will come. But one thing I can say, if Trump will realize that Putin is kicking his butt, he will never allow him to do this. He will beat him back. So that's the difference between today's White House and Trump.
What do you think about the potential or the European Union issuing defense bonds as a means to finance common security initiatives or joint debt? This is a topic of debate in Ireland, and obviously certain member states are neutral, so it poses a kind of like a negative opportunity for disagreement, I suppose, for those who want to pursue it. What do you think about that?
That's purely financial instrument. You can do it via increasing European budget directly. We have multi-annual European budget for 7 years. You can increase this budget because now budget is about 1%. It's a joke. If you want to have more common policies to do, including defense common policy, which is not in the treaties, but you can politically agree to have this policy together, you can just increase European budget. The bonds, it's practically you having the same only in longer term. For example, bonds could be 10, 20, or even 50 years. So you just not doing this in 7 years, but you're doing longer. So it's more or less the same. It's purely a difference in instruments, financial instruments. But that's again about political will. If you want to have some joint purchases of equipment or other things, you can do it by the political agreement for European budget. So, and for example, the Nordic countries do have tradition to agree on a lot of things to make together, but that's easier in smaller group of countries which have tradition to cooperate in a lot of areas. The Baltic states also trying to do this, but in most cases in Europe it was not very successful. Why? It is up to us politically to decide to go through budget or through the bonds or whatever we can, or special fund, whatever, how we call it. Political will necessary to do it.
Karen Culver asks in the chat, how should Europe approach possible migrants from Europe, and raises the security concern around security risks to Europe, or people escaping war and conscription.
You mean here it's about Ukrainians or general migrants?
Russian migrants.
Russian migrants. Oh yeah. No, you know, for me it's very difficult to generalize, but at least in Lithuania and in Baltic states, we are very cautious, very cautious. We try to make a very serious checks about it. And in our case, we're making a lot of filters of security about the incomings, especially from Russia and Belarus, because we have Belarus on our border also. So here we do evaluate that risks are possible. Security risks are possible.
And Christian Massini has their hand raised. Trying to unmute there, I'm not sure that's working.
Christian, we are sending you.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah,
now.
thank you. Thanks, Excellency. Quick question with regards, you mentioned also the cyber threats and hybrid threats that obviously come along. And one natural name that pops up is obviously China. I'm currently reading a master's by research in political science within the University of Malta, and my main area of focus is actually European digital strategy and digital autonomy, with a special focus on China. And my question to you would be, how would European Union approach strategic autonomy, in bearing in mind that it's today it's evolved to open strategic autonomy to amalgamate and process in economics, finance, commerce, and the digital sphere as well. How would the European Union adapt to these hybrid attacks and the new kind of technology that's coming over from China, and which basically we've passed from this before? Once China sees another nation, another semi-power like India, coming up strongly, threatening its place, it will double its efforts to retain that particular place it currently holds in this well, technically multipolar geopolitical sphere. So European Union is already doing something in terms of policy making, but from actual writing to actualizing whatever is being written, it takes years. And for small countries like Ireland, like Malta, that would be much more hard because we lack the infrastructure. How would we, as smaller countries, be able to tackle the threats that are coming from China, the likes of China, the likes maybe even of India eventually? Thank you.
To do it separately and only by our own, it's practically impossible. Already Lithuania and Baltic states, a few years ago, we proposed for European Commission to create cybersecurity unit in European Commission, where debunking of information is made, and then we transit it also to the NATO. And together with NATO, we also trying to more invest into cyber security element and to protect collectively. Why? Member states not only making cyber security shield, but also emergency mechanism, which exchange of information to help support and block the attack together. A small country sometimes not able to do it. So this is already in the process of production on NATO level and European Union level. So small countries alone, we will not be able to do it because some economies and businesses are already global and they expose globally, and you cannot just think that you can create the somewhat firewall and be isolated from everybody and be secure. No, that's not the case. So from security point of view, Europe protecting its economy and NATO protecting, because energy, for example, other industries are also security. It's our security. You cannot even distinguish the energy grid from, let's say, war, a hybrid war, weaponization. And this is all about our security in general. So economy, everything, food, health, energy, everything is our security. It's now so mixed that you cannot distinguish where is economy, where is military security. So there is nothing anymore separately. So yes, Europe and NATO are doing this together, and small countries need to be very eager to push this process faster. And we in Baltic states, we're doing this, and Lithuania is doing this. And we have been one of the first to push Europe to think about it. Even before the war, it was immediately after Crimea occupation. But of course, national entities need to be seriously engaged, and our cybersecurity department and entity is near the defense ministry. So how we see this in our views, that it is military defense is involved, and not only for military, but also for energy and even for private businesses. They are receiving protection if they apply or if they inform our entity that they're under attack. And exchange of information, of course, exchange of technologies and information between partners, NATO and European Union.
I have a feeling we could really talk all day about this, but I just really want to thank Her Excellency Dalia Grybauskaitė for your insights and frankness and contribution to this discussion. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to move now to our other three speakers to continue this discussion, and there will be a chance to ask questions after all three have concluded their remarks. First up, Dr. Cécile Pelaudeix is an EU 3D Research Fellow at the Grenoble Institute of Political Science, Sciences Po, and also teaches there. Her research centers on international relations with focus on differentiation and dominance, globalization and regional governance, European foreign policy, Chinese foreign policy in the areas of security, sustainable development, energy and ocean governance. She's also advised governments and EU institutions on matters of her research interests. So Cécile, please go ahead with your remarks, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for inviting me in this prestigious panel. The concept of European strategic autonomy has gained considerable traction in recent years. It captures the capacity to act autonomously in cooperation with like-minded partners. It was first applied in 2013 to Europe's defense and security policy in the wake of Brexit and the Russian invasion of Crimea, and while the US was less predictable in terms of its support of multilateral security under Trump's presidency. The COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine and the growing American unilateralism have increased the need to diversify sourcing to mitigate supply chain disruption and geopolitical risks. The concept of strategic autonomy has thus been extended to the economic sector. The risk of China's policy on EU's economic security relates to China's global agenda and its policies in the EU. Since the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, China is deepening its influence with the Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative, both launched in 2022. China's influence in the EU relates to the control over critical infrastructure such as ports and airports, key technological and industrial sectors, including dual-use technologies, strategic materials, and supply chains. Such a control is not the product of a simple market logic. The EU is concerned with export restrictions, a lack of transparency on subsidies, and a forced technology transfer. Now, in the context of the war in Ukraine, the relationship of China with Russia further complicates the achievement of EU strategic autonomy. President Xi expressed his unlimited friendship with Putin's Russia. Chinese industrial support to Russia is strongly correlated with the growing convergence between Beijing and Moscow to reshape the world order. More than the direct supply of weapons, a red line that China seems careful not to cross until now, it is the supply of machine tools and components for the production of these weapons that is the focus of attention. While the EU has imposed economic sanctions on Russia, it has adopted since 2019 a multifaceted policy approach towards China and now considers it to be a partner in terms of cooperation and negotiation, an economic competitor, and a systemic rival. The EU's doctrinal and policy shift from liberalism to using economic tools for geopolitical purposes has been called the EU geo-economic turn. In 2023, the EU adopted an economic security strategy which sets out how to mitigate identified risks through a three-pronged approach, namely by first, promoting the EU's own security, economy, and industry to make them more resilient and competitive, partnering with the broadest possible range of partners, but also by protecting the EU's economy by using a full range of new commercial instruments. I will address a few of them. First, the foreign direct investment screening regulation is an enabling framework that lays down rules for cooperation and sharing of information on foreign direct investment between EU member states and the European Commission in the event of security or public order issues. Its scope is limited as it must remain within the EU's openness to capital investments and with the existing World Trade Organization approach. As a regulation, it is mandatory, but somewhat paradoxically, it does not contain an obligation for member states to initiate a foreign direct investment screening and the adoption of measures preventing or conditioning a foreign direct investment is the ultimate responsibility of member states. The European Commission is only authorized to issue non-binding advisory opinions if the foreign direct investment affects EU interest. In addition, it contains only minimal procedural requirements for all national screening authorities. And indeed, critical deals have not been all stopped, such as the controversial Hamburg port deal. In 2022, the German government gave authorization for an investment by COSCO involving an almost 25% stake in the shipping company that runs a terminal at the port of Hamburg. And this decision did not take into consideration the opinion given by the Commission pursuant to the FDI screening regulation. The Commission is currently revising the regulation to address its shortcomings, including the case when a foreign investor establishes a subsidiary in a member state without a screening mechanism, then organizes its further investments through that subsidiary. As fair rules of international trade are not always respected, the EU has adopted additional defensive measures. The anti-coercion instrument is one of them. It proposes to empower the Commission with the capacity to deploy restrictions on trade and investments in case when a non-EU country interferes in the policy choice at the EU or national level. The Lithuanian case is notable, as a response to its decision to open a Taiwanese representative office in Vilnius, China restricted its trade with Lithuania. The anti-coercion regulation defines economic coercion as a situation when a non-EU country attempts to pressure the EU or a member state into making a specific choice by applying or threatening to apply trade or investment measures. This kind of coercion is actually not covered by the World Trade Organization agreement. And the instrument is primarily meant to have a deterrent effect. However, it allows the EU to economic coercion with countermeasures, including imposition of tariffs, restrictions in trade of goods and services, intellectual property rights, or foreign direct investment. So the ACI may signal a watershed moment for the EU if we consider that the Commission's role in implementing economic security policies allows the EU to adopt countermeasures. However, the fact that it is the ability of the Council to judge whether economic coercion is occurring still offers an opening for China's direct or indirect pressure, as well as an opportunity to magnify any European divisions should an agreement not be reached quickly. While other instruments include the EU's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, Forced Labour Regulation, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, the EU's International Procurement Instrument, or the Foreign Subsidies Regulation. Actually, the EU showed a remarkable level of resilience, also if we consider the number of measures that it has adopted in terms of cybersecurity, as reminded by President Grybauskaitė. So I will conclude this short presentation with one remark of a geopolitical nature. Indeed, economic interdependence was expected to bring about peace and security, but evidence shows that, on the contrary, it is increasing vulnerability and bringing insecurity. That, however, looking for strategic autonomy, even specifying an open strategic autonomy, would end up exacerbating power imbalances between the EU, as well as protectionism abroad. So reaching strategic autonomy is a fine line, especially when we consider that China is drawing closer to Russia and is spreading a narrative of a benevolent China supporting South-South cooperation, and the narrative of a global West opposed to a global South, a narrative which is used to delegitimize the EU's path to more autonomy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions about that too. Really appreciate those remarks. Next, we have Dr. Niall Moran, an assistant professor at EU Trade Law at the School of Law and Government, DCU, and deputy director of the DCU Brexit Institute, organisers of this discussion. He holds a PhD in international economic law from Bocconi University and has worked for the legal service of the Council of the European Union and the bilateral relations with the Americas unit at DG Agri, the European Commission. Previously, he was a lecturer in law at Middlesex University in London, research associate at Pluricourts University of Oslo, and a visiting researcher at the Université Libre de Brussels. Niall, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Una. So I want to begin by saying that after a speech like President Grybauskaitė's on the war in Ukraine, it can almost seem trivial to go into the minutiae of the latest regulation on subsidies. But I would just say that it's important to bear in mind that a significant part of the EU's strength is built on having a properly functioning internal market, and that this enables us to be a major actor on these other bigger questions. Indeed, it has been through China's economic success that it has emerged as such a powerful global actor in recent decades. But to get to the topic of today and the impact of the war in Ukraine on strategic autonomy, I think it's fair to say that it has had a profound impact. EU member states have had to re-examine many areas, from energy dependencies to military capabilities, military alignment. And we see this with countries like Finland and more recently Sweden joining NATO. there has been a reflection on where we can act collectively to do things better, be it joint procurement or Eurobonds, as we've discussed. So these areas that we've heard about relate to the security elements of strategic autonomy, but I'm going to focus more on the economic and trade aspects of strategic autonomy. And I have three main points. So firstly, on strategic autonomy, the agenda has been significantly shaped by the introduction of several instruments designed to ensure a level playing field in the EU single market, but also to strengthen the EU's trade defence toolbox. So one example of this is the EU enforcement regulation introduced in 2021 in response to the current crisis at the WTO. And this enables the EU to enforce its rights where a fellow member won't agree to an adjudicated outcome. But I think the headline initiative, certainly at the minute, is the Foreign Subsidies Regulation, which came into force last year. So this builds on our anti-subsidy regulation, and it effectively extends EU state aid rules to third countries. So this instrument has been used 4 times already this year. One example is in relation to tenders for electric trains in Bulgaria involving a Chinese state-owned manufacturer, CRRC. I'm going to come back to this train company in my next point, so just keep them in mind. But it was the most recent use of the foreign subsidies regulation that has raised the most eyebrows in Europe. Last month, it was used to carry out a dawn raid against a Chinese company, Nuctec. So this company provides security equipment across the airports of Europe, and as part of its investigation, the Commission seized documents, phones, and equipment from the company. So we're beginning to see what strategic autonomy means in the practice of EU trade policy, and in terms of the foreign subsidies regulation, it appears to mean dawn raids. So the regulation allows the Commission to conduct inspections under Article 10 and ensure that non-European entities are as transparent about their funding as EU entities. But this use of dawn raids is unprecedented in the EU in respect of third country subsidies. So there is a question of whether we should expect a significant reaction from China to raids such as these. I think that the first investigation targeting Nuctec was well chosen, as this is a company that is banned in other Western countries, such as Canada and the US, on national security grounds. So China would be aware of this and the possibility that EU member states could likely do similar. A final interesting point on Nuctec is that the equipment is permitted and used in 26 out of 27 member states. Any guesses which state doesn't permit them? It's Lithuania. So I think it will be fascinating to see how this tool will be used by the next Commission. A final element of this that I would mention and possibly warn about is that the ease of carrying out dawn raids isn't the same in each EU member state. So this raid on Nuctec was carried out in the Netherlands, where no warrant is needed for such an investigation. But in other jurisdictions, such as Ireland, Germany, a court order is required before such a raid can be carried out. So the last thing the EU wants is a situation where a member state becomes an attractive destination for investment on the basis that it wouldn't be as easy to carry out a dawn raid against foreign businesses there, particularly in the midst of a rule of law crisis. My next point relates to the dynamics among EU member states, differing visions of strategic autonomy and how this is managed. So there may be clashes in visions, be they north-south, east-west, large member state versus small member state. They may arise in various areas such as energy independence. Germany might act differently to other Central European countries. But the area I want to focus on for a minute is EU merger policy. So in 2019, the Commission famously blocked the merger of Siemens-Alstom in the rail market. And this prompted Germany and France to issue a document calling for a revision of this policy. So this illustrates the traditional divide between large and small member states in respect of these large mergers. Member states like Ireland viewing these as being potentially anti-competitive, while France and Germany are more for promoting these European champions, as recently called for by Macron. So the Commission did not agree that Chinese competition would enter the EU market, deeming this to be highly unlikely. But as you may recall, the Commission has just investigated China's company bidding for a tender on electric trains in Bulgaria. So actually this did happen within a few years. So I think smaller member states need to reevaluate their opposition in areas like this. Keep in mind the need for Europe to have companies capable of competing on a global scale rather than 27 smaller national markets. At the same time, if larger member states are to get smaller member states on board, then I think they need to show themselves to be above the petty politics of divide and conquer. So a good example of this, I think, is the recent visits of Xi Jinping to France and Germany, where Macron gets reassurances about LVMH's cognac. Scholz apparently received similar promises. And it has been suggested that blocking bids under the the foreign subsidies regulation might lead to conflict among member states if this leads to higher prices, the lowest bid potentially being excluded. But the alternative is a system where we accept potentially subsidized bids from China while actively blocking our own champions from emerging, which wouldn't really be acceptable in the EU. My third point and final point relates to open strategic autonomy. As mentioned, the two terms have been coupled together in this term of the Commission, and it conveys the need to balance protecting EU industry from unfair trading practices with the desire to have open markets. In a piece for the Brexit Institute last week, I called for the open in this formula to be reinvigorated, as the strategic autonomy element has arguably dominated the term of this Commission. We've only concluded some relatively minor trade agreements over the lifetime of this Commission, and I will conclude by saying that the EU has to strategically target partners over its 5-year cycles, even where agreements with larger trading partners seem elusive. Some might say that this is overly critical because deals with the large trading partners, China, India, the US, it may appear as though they're not going to happen at the minute. But that's why we have to be strategic. Maybe it's easier to negotiate with Brazil now, just as it was easier to deal with the US when TTIP was being negotiated. So we need to examine why these deals have not gone over the line, what the cost of that has been, and how we should do things differently next time when a deal is possible. I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Niall. Next is Professor Ming, Professor in Chinese Law and Co-Director of the Global Policy Institute. Prior to joining Durham in September 2019, he was Professor in Chinese and Comparative Law at the University of Surrey from April 2016, and Reader in International Business Law at Lancaster University from September 2013. Completed his Chinese law training at Tsinghua University School of Law in Beijing. He holds an LLM from Harvard Law School, where he was a Victor William Fung Fellow, and a DPhil from the University of Oxford, where he was a Clarendon Scholar. His current research focuses on the theoretical and structural issues of global economic governance, China's approach to international law, and the development of the rule of law in contemporary China. Ming, please go ahead with your remarks.
Thank you, Una. And so it's a great pleasure to share the floor with Cécile and Niall. And Cécile has given us a wonderful contextualization of the concept of strategic autonomy and some inherent ambiguity of the concept. I think Niall has shown us how the concept of strategic autonomy has been put into action. As Niall has told us, the idea of open strategic autonomy has been fully integrated in European Union trade and economic policies. So I was asked to reflect on what all this means. In other words, what are the implications of the EU's evolving trade, investment, and return on industry policies for the world trading system at large, and also how China views China's evolving trade policies. I noted both our speakers mentioned a lot about China, and it's probably interesting to discuss how China sees all this. Now, I will briefly talk about 3 points. The first point is, I'm a non-EU lawyer. I'm from outside, from UK and from China. So when I look at the EU's evolving trade policy, what are the key features that catch my eye and strike me as something I should pay more attention? I want to briefly mention 3. The first is the move from economic interdependence to strategic autonomy. So for many years, when I teach international economic law, when I talk about what are the foundations of current international economic order, we talk about comparative advantage, talk about economic efficiency, and talk about all the economic benefits arising from globalization, how they contribute not only to the wealth creation, but also global peace. But and consistent with these powerful insights, I think for many years, European trade policy has been generally sought to reduce international trade investment barriers and also try to foster an open, transparent, non-discriminatory multilateral trading system. So now the current European policy seems to be deviated from this. It forces us to revisit our assumptions of the current international economic order, sees what goes wrong and what are the merits of the Europeans' new policy. The second point I want to highlight is the EU's trade policy is current. Instead of international cooperation and the multilateral governance, the EU has taken a unilateral approach to pursue strategic autonomy. As Cécile, I think Niall have given us many examples of current European new regulations, including foreign subsidy regulation, and Niall has just mentioned. A standard feature of these examples, all these regulations, is that they apply the objectives and the values of the European Union, act unilaterally on the regulation of international economy, and force other countries to alter their behavior. The third feature strikes me as a return of industrial policy. So industrial policy is highly controversial. With the rise of neoliberalism since 1970s, over the past 40 years, I think industrial policy has been discredited both in academic and policy debates, but now it has a full return in other parts of the world as well as European Union. So I'm curious how the EU's embrace of industrial policy, what's new about the EU's new industrial policy, and how could you make sure that it works this time? So these three new features are striking me. Now let me clarify that I'm not questioning the wisdom of the European Union's new trade policy, although there's room to debate, for example, whether globalization and the economic interdependence reduce resilience, as many suggested, and whether reduce resilience of supply chains or whether industrial policy could be successfully implemented. There's room to debate, but I'm sure there are very good reasons for the European Union to highlight the importance of strategic economy in the changing landscape of geopolitical and geoeconomic competition, as many of our speakers outlined, and adopt corresponding measures. Let me come to the second point. So what are the implications of the EU's evolving trade policy for the future of international economic law? I will again briefly mention three key points. First, I will not use eye-catching phrases like death of the WTO and its dispute settlement system. Most likely the WTO will survive, will be around, and trade ministers will meet annually somewhere nice every year, but I would not have very high hopes for the revival of the WTO negotiations or the paralyzed WTO dispute settlement system. The reason is very simple. Look at the new features of the EU's trade policy I just outlined. It doesn't need a lot of imagination to know that once great powers have went down the route of strategic autonomy and take a unilateral approach to global economic governance, other great powers, even middle powers, will follow suit. And the world trading system will be fragmented. Moreover, some of the unilateral trade measures, well, despite all the controversy, may not be consistent with the current WTO rules. Then we think about it. If countries compete to achieve economic or strategic autonomy, and they know very clearly that some of their measures are not consistent with WTO rules, then the question is, who wants a strong WTO and who wants a strong WTO dispute settlement system and complies with old WTO rules now perceived as outdated? Probably no one wants it anymore. Second point, with the decline of multilateralism, we can expect the rise of regional free trade agreements and even some informal trade agreements, because like-minded countries and partners, they need this legal framework to continue to cooperate. The third, even if WTO comes back to life, as the EU is a very strong defender of the WTO, its multilateralism and the rule of law, at least rhetorically, we can expect to see that there will be more exceptions and carve-outs to fundamental WTO principles like most favored nation principle or national treatment. And there will be more differential interpretation of WTO current rules to give states more autonomy to pursue non-trade objectives like the green transition to clean energy, like economic security many of us have discussed today. In other words, international economic law will not be a straitjacket. International economic law will not be able to prevent states from pursuing more autonomy. Then last quick point I want to mention is how does China view all this? So China's trade policy objectives have never been economic interdependence, have never been about economic efficiency. It's about economic independence in all strategic sectors. That's a fundamental difference between China and other countries. Now, China clearly does not like the Europeans' idea of de-risking rather than decoupling, because China sees as very similar terms. There's no fundamental difference, and China wants to do more trade with the European Union rather than less. At the same time, the EU's evolving trade policy and the changing geo-economic landscape we discussed so much today is likely to strengthen rather than alter China's current approach to trade. While trying to win Europeans back, as President Xi visited the European Union and met European leaders probably last week, and China is trying to want to be European Union's friend and want to try win you back. China is probably prepared to follow Mao Zedong's advice before the founding of the People's Republic of China back in 1949. Mao said back then was cast away illusions and prepare to struggle. And I think that concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. Would any of the panelists like to pick up on any of the points their fellow speakers have made, first of all, before we get to other questions?
Thanks, Una. I might just begin by following up with Ming on your really interesting speech. I just want to ask, is there one EU instrument that you find to be particularly concerning? If we consider the foreign subsidy regulation, which I talked about in some depth, for instance, if we hadn't had that and there was this bid from CRRC in relation to this Bulgarian train line, it likely would have been successful. So I for one, am glad that it was there for that purpose. I think it served its purpose well in this instance. But is there any instrument overall that you view as particularly concerning? Thanks.
Thank you, Niall. Once European, I think European regulations you just mentioned could be roughly divided into two groups. One group of regulations, precisely what you said, like foreign subsidies regulation. We do not have current international rules addressing foreign subsidies. Therefore, the European regulation is more like filling the gap. There's an ambiguous area European Union move in and have something new nobody has seen before, and nobody can say definitively this is discriminatory. But the problem is we've seen the track record is all targeted China. Then China has a good reason to say, I'm targeted, I'm discriminated against. It violates not necessarily the rules, but probably the spirit of international economic law. It's discriminatory. But second category is more problematic. I give you two examples. One is CBAM, right? Like one is the CBAM is a clear one example. Another one is deforestation regulation. I mean, those issues theoretically, I mean, after US shrimp, theoretically, you could design the whole system in a way that's consistent with the WTO rules. But the problem is the devil in the details. It's very hard for you to design that. How do you take care of those global south? Different countries have different situations, have different economic development levels. Could you treat them fairly about 100 different countries? Theoretically, yes, but practically, if somebody brings that regulation to WTO and you'll be found non-consistent with current EU's international regulations. Thank you, Niall. I think that is what I think.
Thanks, Ming. That's really interesting, and I completely agree with you that it cannot be applied in a discriminatory manner. And it is interesting that there have been 4 investigations so far this year, all against Chinese companies. And so I think the Commission needs to be careful that it isn't seen to be discriminatory in any way.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Federico, you have a question there?
Yeah, thanks, Una. And sorry, I hope I'm not abusing my role here, but I'm obviously very interested about this discussion, and I hope other people will ask questions as well. But if I can maybe bring in the discussion, a news of the day, the decision by the Biden administration to increase tariffs on some Chinese products, particularly those connected to the green transition, and sort of pick up the expertise of our panelists about that big development. But if I can put that as a question, and the question would more or less be the following. Of course, the presenters, given their background, have mostly approached the matter from the perspective of international economic law and the rules of the World Trade Organization. But from a political perspective, isn't there a strong argument from a domestic politics point of view in favor of somehow protecting some industries, particularly at the time of election? So I'm putting this provocatively, obviously, and is it in the interest of WTO law that Biden wins the next presidential election? Because if Trump wins, it's going to be a lot worse for the WTO. And more generally, hasn't there been too much of a backlash against those dynamics of globalization we've seen in the last 20 years? The rise of the far right, isn't that somehow also connected to economic dislocations and so on and so forth? So how do we address those non-legal, by definition, but very important political issues, preserving the good of global trade, but also making sure that this becomes more fair and that doesn't disadvantage too much specific countries? So I'm conscious I'm raising a big issue, and it's a provocative one, as I said, but I'd be happy to have the speakers' thoughts on that.
I might take that one, actually. Federico, yeah, I agree that there is an argument for protectionism. And one of my students said to me this semester, when I hear American cars made by American workers with American steel, it resonates with me, and I see why people vote for Trump. And I said to him, yes, it might resonate, but the reason why it doesn't work in the long term is because that car will be double the price. And it might take a bit of time for it to kick in, but ultimately, we see the reason why everyone has been buying Chinese goods in Europe rather than, French equivalents is because they're so much cheaper. And that is ultimately the problem with, protectionism writ broad. On the Biden 100% tariff move, when I heard Trump announcing a 10% tariff wall around the US, me and a lot of lawyers like us, our heads melted a bit. So when we hear 100%, let's just say it's a lot worse. As I said to you earlier, I think, if there's an election coming, that's the logic behind it. But in terms of, conveying to the Rust Belt that I'm here to protect American jobs, I understand why Biden did it. But of course, I don't support it broadly. I'll let others come in on this.
So could I just add something on that? I think this problem is very complicated. So when we talk about the Chinese green industrial technology, EVs, we ask question, what makes Chinese products so competitive? So now a very strong narrative is that's because Chinese, the state capitalism structure, that China's industrial policy, China's subsidies, or various, measures which help Chinese companies so competitive. They're probably partially true, but and I also see many economists argue that even if Chinese companies do not have any subsidies from Chinese government, they will still be very competitive. But of course, that's hypothetical. We don't know about it. So question is, the Chinese products are very competitive. Now our attention is on the Chinese government subsidies and other policies. Then we argue those policies are unfair trade practices, and we need to counteract about it. I mean, that makes the issue very complicated, because we think China engaged in unfair trade practices. The second point I want to say is it clearly shows the dilemma that the European Union and I believe other countries are facing at the same time. The first, I think the European Union now is green transition, want to reach net zero in the future, in a couple of years. You need a lot of green products like EVs, like solar panels, like others. But then you ask, where do you get it? The answer is from China. You see, and you want to achieve two objectives at the same time: green transition and strategic autonomy. They may not be reconcilable if you exclude China from this picture. You exclude China products, you are hurting consumers, you will slow the process to green transition. So if you plus all at the same time, you think that we cannot allow Chinese to take over the whole industry, then you make the whole thing so complex and very complicated. The third point I want to say is, what's the role of international law? That's the issue of speaking law to power, and law never wins. That is, it's always protectionism is good. If you want to say, let's protect our workers, use American steel to produce American cars to serve US consumers, we cannot allow Chinese to eat our lunch. Everybody, who will be against it? So that's the normal way to go down to protectionism and go down to some economic disasters. Thank you.
I might just ask a question of Cécile, actually, just bring in. On national legislation on FDI screening, is there a best practice in your view? So I know I contacted you after having read your paper on France's intervention in relation to China's acquisition of Toulouse Airport. And, since then, there have been a lot of national piece of legislation, Ireland, Greece, for instance. But maybe just, I'd like to hear an update on this, Cécile.
Well, the foreign direct investment screening regulation has been implemented since 2020 in force and is working well, but there are some shortcomings, as I was saying. I think there's one main upside is that there's a growing awareness that there can be some risks from foreign direct investment, but there are still some communities which are not always aware of these risks. Some of the economic community which deem that they know sufficiently about these mechanisms and they can avoid the geopolitical consequences. There are still some foreign direct investment going through in the EU which are problematic, and also exports in arms equipment, for example. So I think now it's up to the member states now, since to decide how far they want to go in the revising of this regulation, because it's a very lax regulation, paradoxically. But I mean, it's a first step, and I think it's, however, it's going really fast. The understanding I have of the situation is that the EU has shown an amazing level of resilience throughout the years. But I would like to pick up from what Professor Ming was saying about interdependence and China. And I think it's important to remind that the managing of interdependence is sometimes very interesting for China, and sometimes China is also willing to have this a high level of interdependence. I could quote President Xi, who said in April 2020, giving a speech at the 7th meeting of the Central Financial and Economic Affairs Commission, that we must tighten international production chains' dependence on China, forming powerful countermeasures and deterrent capabilities based on artificially cutting off supply to foreigners. So I think indeed, as Professor Ming said, the EU is really supportive to multilateralism and is really willing that the World Trade Organization reform is going on and succeeding. But meanwhile, since it's not a given, it's quite logical that the EU is trying to, not excluding China, but trying to reach a level playing field in the international trade.
Thanks for that, Cécile. Before we close, I believe Federica has a question. Is that correct?
Yes, can you hear me? I have a question for Professor Du. I was wondering, basically the fact that he is putting a lot of energy in retooling instruments for collective defense at the defense industry level. Like at the moment, 80% is bought in the US and 20% in Europe, but they want to bring it up to 50% by 2030. That's my understanding. And it's been recently highlighted that if this all works out, the defense industrial strategy of the EU, Europe will gain sort of a Pentagon engine in European defense industry. So I was wondering if Professor Du could tell us what China's view is on that. Thank you.
Sorry, which industry? I just missed the some parts of it.
European defense industry. I was wondering what's China's view on the recent European defense industry strategy.
I'm sorry. So this is something I didn't pay much attention to. Probably I need to take a look so I can. So this is really something I didn't pay much attention.
Oh,
sorry about this. Yeah.
Oh, I see. If any other of the panelists wants to give it a try.
I think this is more Cécile's area than mine. But,
Well, could you please reformulate the question, please?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. No, I was wondering, the question was for Professor Du originally. So I was kind of curious to hear China's vision on the EU's new defense industrial strategy. That's all. Like the fact that the EU is trying to invest more, kind of retool CSDP instruments for collective defense purposes and try to buy less American and produce more in the EU in that respect. So just wondering if you have any views on that, also from the EU's perspective.
Right,
related to new munitions factories and so on is.
Yeah, exactly. The EDIS and ASAP as well.
Cécile?
Well, that's a important question which would need a thorough answer. And I have not all the data here to give a very a strong answer, but for sure, China has increased its military might and is also exercising an arms diplomacy around the world. and also is increasing its influence through the Global Security Initiative. So it is engaging in strategic partnerships with more and more countries. Also in the EU, it is engaging in arms sales with Serbia and its Global Security Initiative is testifying of its willingness to play a more important role in dealing with international security. It's not a very specific answer, but that's all I could provide so far.
I'd just say I think China might view it as, you know, an extension or part of EU strategic autonomy, but perhaps not the most worrying aspect, and they might be more focused on the economic potential decoupling. That would just be my quick response. But thanks a lot for the question, Federica.
I think that's all for today. Thank you very much to everyone for participating, panelists Ming, Cécile, Niall, Her Excellency Dalia, Grybauskaitė, and also my fellow European Young Leader alumni, Federico Fabrini as well, and everybody who attended, and for all of your questions. Certainly learned a lot and I really appreciate it, and obviously goes without saying, encourage everyone to exercise their vote in the upcoming elections. So enjoy the rest of the evening wherever you are.
And thank you, Una, for moderating this on behalf of DCU and the Brexit Institute. See you very soon.
Thanks, Una.
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.